Steve, the Argos head into the Eastern Conference Final at BMO Field this weekend against the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Kind of a miracle season for them. Can you kind of put into context what's happened with them this year, finishing 9-9? What do you make of it?
I think it's one of the great stories we've seen in Canadian sport in an awfully long time. Here's a down-and-out CFL franchise. They didn't have a coach last winter. They waited 3 months from the time the CFL season ended before hiring a general manager and a coach. That's Jim Popp and Mark Trestman. And so they missed the period of free agency, basically. They missed all of the players who were available. And when Trestman and Popp went to work on March 1st, they had no players to speak of. They had no coaching staff. And here they are, one win from the Grey Cup. And they've done marvelous work in pulling all this together under really awful conditions. They haven't really had a practice field per se. They've moved around and now settled in at a high school, a former high school in Toronto, and it's just been a lot of things thrown at them, not the least of which is they don't have a fan base that fills the stadium, although I'm told that this will be the biggest crowd of the season on Sunday. But it's amazing to me. No players, no coach, had to build a receiving corps, didn't have any receivers, didn't have any defensive backs, didn't have linebackers, had to bring people in. The one thing he did have, because he didn't spend in free agency, was some money. Yeah. So he was able to be a little bit creative. Jim Popp was able to be a little bit creative in bringing people in like S.J. Green, who's had a fabulous year, and James Wilder, who's had a fabulous year. And the interesting thing with Wilder is Jim Popp had Wilder on the neg list in Montreal. When he got fired in Montreal, he went home and got the Toronto job eventually. When he looked at Montreal's neg list, guess whose name wasn't on it anymore? They dropped James Wilder. He picked him up, went and signed him. And the last 6 games of the regular season, after he wasn't starting, just more part of the makes the story so rich. James Wilder's averaged 190 yards of total offense between catching and running the ball the final 6 weeks of the season. He's been a gem for the Argos.
The Argos finished 9-9, like we said. Any of this a product of the East just not being that good, quite frankly?
Well, 9-9 in the CFL will almost always get you in the playoffs. Whether you're not going to finish first very often that way, but it will almost always get you in the playoffs. In fact, the Argos' last Grey Cup win in the 100th Grey Cup, they were 9-9 that season. And so, it's a long year in the CFL, and often the team like Calgary last year had the best record, didn't win the Grey Cup. Often that's the case, that the team with the best record, like in the NHL, like in other sports, doesn't always work that way. So I think it's a question of, Scott Milano used to say it when he coached the Argos, I don't care what we are in August, but I care what we are in October and November. And if you're peaking at the right time, then you can compete for the Grey Cup. And if you have a quarterback like Ricky Ray, that's the one thing they did have. They had him. They had to build around him, and that was a big thing to do.
You talked about the crowd a little bit. A lot of expectation. Fans are getting excited to see a full BMO field at a CFL game for maybe the first time this season, besides maybe the opener. But what about just on the field, just quickly? What do you think about how this game's going to take shape?
I don't have a clue who's going to. I honestly, this weekend in the CFL, I can see all 4 teams winning, and I can see all 4 teams losing. I think it's that close. Saskatchewan has been coming on the last, say, 5 weeks or so. It's like Milanovic says, they are the hot team going in, but they won last week in Ottawa. Can they win again on the road? And then they've brought stuff to stay in the East for 3 weeks, for the Eastern Final, for last week's playoff game, and for next week's Grey Cup. So they're not fooling around here, but Argos have had lead. They've not beaten Saskatchewan, but they've had leads of 10 points or more in both games that they ended up losing.
That game goes Sunday at BMO Field. You can read more of Steve Simmons in the Toronto Sun this weekend.